Hello everyone, Mr. Linder here. Let's take a look at the adrenal gland in this lesson. So the adrenal glands actually are paired glands that sit on top of our kidneys. And each gland consists of a medulla and an outer cortex. Think of the adrenal medulla as part of the sympathetic nervous system. So when you think about the inner portion of this gland, you really want to think of it in terms of a location that's connected to the nervous system and where you can produce things like norepinephrine and epinephrine. And we actually refer to epinephrine as adrenaline and norepinephrine as noradrenaline because they come from the adrenal glands in some instances. We also get epinephrine and norepinephrine from other locations, and we use them as neurotransmitters, but you could see how that naming is used. In this lesson, I want to focus mostly on the cortex of the adrenal gland. So the cortex is actually divided into layers, and it's actually hormonally stimulated by adrenocorticotropic hormone. So ACTH is actually produced by the anterior pituitary, circulates in the bloodstream, and it has that trophic effect on the adrenal cortex. And so it can hypertrophy or atrophy depending upon if we have increased levels of ACTH or decreased levels of ACTH. And upon hormonal stimulation from ACTH, we can get a variety of hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex. And actually, the adrenal cortex hormones are actually steroid hormones. So I want to show you a zoomed in photo here. So this is zooming in on the adrenal gland. So here again, we have the adrenal medulla, and then here we have the cortex. And if you take a look at the cortex, you actually can see that it's divided into layers. So you have an outer portion, which is the capsule. Okay, so the capsule is the outer portion of the adrenal gland. But then we have these layers of the adrenal cortex. So we have the Zona Glomerulosa, we have the Zona Fasiculata, and then we have the Zona Reticularis. And then on the interior or deep inside the gland is where you have the adrenal medulla, and that's where we get the catecholamines, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. So these hormones that are produced by the cortex are actually steroid-based hormones. And steroid-based hormones are actually derived from cholesterol. So we take the precursor molecule cholesterol, and we can actually use enzymes. So there's lots of enzymes that we can use to modify cholesterol into various steroid-based hormones. So for simplicity, a lot of these intermediates are left out. So you can see on this diagram, there's no labels for some of these molecules. It's just so that we can focus in on the main steroid-based hormones of interest. But things to remember is that each step here, if you see an arrow, there's going to be an enzyme catalyzing a reaction. So there's always an enzyme for these types of reactions. On this particular diagram, there's a couple enzymes labeled. There's the 21-hydroxylase enzyme, and then there's also the aromatase enzyme that's labeled, just again to show you a general idea of what's happening as we convert the precursor cholesterol in the adrenal cortex into these various types of steroid hormones. So here you can see cholesterol being derived into progesterone, and then you can see reactions for progesterone to create things like testosterone or DHT. So basically we're getting androgens. So you can produce androgens from the adrenal cortex. You can also modify these precursor molecules into cortisol. And so we're getting cortisol, which is a long-term stress hormone from the adrenal cortex. And we'll look at lots of functions of cortisol today. And then we also can produce this hormone aldosterone from the precursor cholesterol. And this is for sodium and potassium balance. So I want to go through each layer again, and I want to talk about these three hormones, and then I want to focus more specifically on cortisol today. Well, let's go back and look at the layering of the adrenal cortex. And so to start out with, let's take a look at the zona glomerulosa. So the zona glomerulosa is that more superficial layer of the cortex, and it secretes what we call the mineralocorticoids. And the primary example of the mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. And this aldosterone steroid is responsible for regulating sodium and potassium balance. So what we find is that the aldosterone will actually stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb or hold on to sodium and allow us to get rid of potassium. So if you look at reasons for stimulus of aldosterone, you would say that low levels of sodium and high levels of potassium would be reasons to release aldosterone. Because when you have low levels of sodium, we can reabsorb that sodium, right? So we can reabsorb sodium back into the cardiovascular system, and so therefore we can bring our levels back up. When you have high levels of potassium, you can release aldosterone so that we can excrete more potassium. And that'll bring those levels of potassium down so that we can avoid those situations where the nervous system would become hyperexcitable under high levels of potassium. So aldosterone is regulating the sodium and potassium balance. The next layer is the zona fasiculata, and the zona fasiculata is releasing what are called the glucocorticoids. And the prime example of a glucocorticoid would be cortisol. There are other examples, but cortisol is the main hormone, the main steroid hormone that we generally talk about as the main glucocorticoid. And what this glucocorticoid does, what cortisol basically does, is it stimulates things like gluconeogenesis. So this is how we take things that aren't sugars and turn them into sugars. It also stimulates things like lipolysis, which would be the breakdown of fats. And what we're really doing is we're mobilizing resources. So think of cortisol as something that mobilizes resources. Getting access to sugars, getting access to fatty acids is going to allow us to produce energy, especially in times of stressful situations. And we'll come back to cortisol, and I want to talk more about the various roles in just a minute. There's lots of functions of cortisol. But let's finish up the layers here. So the third layer is this zona reticularis layer. And the zona reticularis is really producing steroids in the form of androgens. So this is where we get things like DHEA, which is dihydroepiandrosterone. It's where we get DHT. And basically these are, these are what we would call masculinizing type hormones. They're essentially male sex steroids, similar to things like testosterone. For males, this is not as vitally important because males have testes and produce typically adequate amounts of testosterone from the testes. But for females, this is your androgen, most of your androgen type production. So this is going to be a supplemental source of steroids when you compare it to your reproductive organs. So females having ovaries producing estrogens and progesterone, but this is where you're going to get androgens that you can use for bone development and muscle development. And then males, again, are using this as a supplemental source, but again, most of the time we're talking about the main testosterone that comes from the testes. So I want to come back to this idea, though, of cortisol, because cortisol has a lot of functions when it comes to physiology in the human body. And so I want to run through some of the more details about cortisol and the different things that it can do. So cortisol is controlled by that hypothalamic pituitary axis that we've looked at before. So the stimulation for release of cortisol starts with the hormone corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then that is the main hormone that is affecting the adrenal cortex. So we can go over here and think of ACTH circulating in the blood and affecting that adrenal cortex layer of the adrenal gland. And so this is where we're going to get the release of cortisol. And cortisol, if you have high levels of it, so as it increases, it can work through a long feedback loop and provide negative feedback on the levels of CRH and ACTH to keep those cortisol levels in balance. So this is a typical negative feedback system that you would see through that hypothalamic pituitary and then adrenal gland axis. Cortisol is interesting in that it has really a strong diurnal signal. And what that really means for us is that we have more cortisol. It follows a day-night cycle. So we have more cortisol in the morning. So there's an increased amount of cortisol in the morning, which means you get up, you have more cortisol, you're going to start accessing resources for the day, and then cortisol levels are going to be lower at night. So in the nighttime, we're going to see levels begin to drop. So higher in the morning and lower at nighttime. And that cycle happens on a daily basis. We're also going to see, though, more cortisol during times of stress. So stress on the body, or the potential for stress on the body, is going to increase the amount of cortisol that we have circulating in our system. Cortisol is a typical steroid type hormone. It's derived from cholesterol. It's produced and synthesized on demand, and then it's released into the bloodstream. And it's got a half-life of about 60 to 90 minutes. So it's going to last much longer in the cardiovascular system than, say, your protein-based hormones, because it's a steroid-based hormone. It's actually going to attach to carriers within the blood, and so it's going to last longer in the bloodstream. Cortisol, because it's a steroid, will pass through cells. So if we were, let me go back to that. Sorry about that. So cortisol will pass through cells just like a typical steroid does. So if this is a cell that's going to receive cortisol, cortisol is going to pass through the membrane, and it's going to bind to receptors that are found within the cytoplasm of the cell. And so therefore, because it's a steroid and it's binding to receptors inside of the cell, it's going to affect transcription and translation. So transcription and translation are going to be effects from the cortisol hormone. And when you go through transcription translation, basically what you're saying is that you're having gene expression. And so genes become active. We produce RNA from the DNA, and then we produce proteins from the RNA, and then we utilize those proteins to do work in the body. So the action at the molecular level is going to be transcription and translation, resulting in protein synthesis, and then those proteins going on to do work. So what kind of work do we get when we're talking about the effects of cortisol on the human body? So cortisol really is responsible for these long-term stress responses that we have. And so what are some of the metabolic things that we see taking place when we have cortisol being released into the cardiovascular system? So one of the things that we see is that cortisol promotes gluconeogenesis. So cortisol is promoting this idea of gluconeogenesis. This is where we take things that aren't sugars and we turn them into sugar. And really, therefore, we're essentially preventing hypoglycemia from taking place. If we can produce sugars from other things, then we're going to prevent the overutilization of glucose and a hypoglycemic effect taking place. And that's vitally important when you're talking about controlling stress within the body and being able to mobilize your body to actually do work. So we need resources to do work. So gluconeogenesis would be something like, taking amino acids and being able to turn them into glucose, and then using that glucose to be able to produce energy, to be able to produce ATP. Where do you get access to some of these things like amino acids? Well, cortisol is going to enhance the breakdown of skeletal muscle protein. So we actually see protein catabolism, or the breakdown of proteins, in the presence of cortisol. And when muscle proteins get broken down, you can then utilize those amino acids to produce glucose through gluconeogenesis. Now, you could see how long-term stress, though, could be problematic if you're continuing to break down your musculature and you're not replenishing those amino acids that you need to build your muscle back up. You could see how the body could begin to waste away or to have some atrophy to it when you go through periods of long-term stress. Cortisol will also enhance lipolysis. Lipolysis means the breakdown of fats. And of course, that's going to free up fatty acids. And we can utilize those fatty acids through a process called beta oxidation to produce ATP. So it's another way for us to produce energy. And so we're mobilizing those resources to do work throughout the day and to combat stressful situations throughout the day. A side effect, essentially, of cortisol, something that can be positive for us, but can also have a negative impact as well, is that cortisol can suppress the immune system. So the functions of the immune system are oftentimes suppressed under the presence of cortisol. Basically, we say that cortisol can have an anti-inflammatory kind of effect. And it does this by preventing the release of chemical signals and antibody production from white blood cells. And so when white blood cells aren't communicating as effectively with each other, that's going to inhibit those natural inflammatory reactions that we have in the body. So there are medications that would mimic this as well. So there are things that we call NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So rather than using a steroid like cortisol to suppress inflammation, you can use non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, something like an ibuprofen that can be used as a suppressor of inflammation for minor inflammatory situations. So if you have minor inflammation in a knee joint or an elbow, you could take some ibuprofen and you could essentially temporarily suppress the immune system and reduce some of the inflammation. But you could see that long-term stress, something that's going to increase cortisol long-term, could be problematic for us because, again, it's affecting the immune system as well as affecting muscle and fat breakdown, and that could be problematic for your overall health. Cortisol also has a negative calcium balance. It actually limits our intestinal absorption of calcium, and it also increases kidney excretion of calcium, and that can have a negative impact on our bone structure. So we have to, again, be careful when you're overusing, say, cortisol to treat inflammation. That can have a negative impact on your calcium balance. This holds true for other types of steroids, asthmatics that take inhalable steroids, or patients that have COPD. That's something to be aware of, that those steroids that you're taking into your body have a negative calcium impact, and that can be problematic for your bones. So you want to make sure that you're using calcium supplementation when you're on those kinds of medications. And then further research has shown that cortisol can actually cause some mood changes that affect memory and actual learning when you have cortisol in excess. And even sometimes when cortisol is deficient. So the research is out there just showing that there are some mood and behavior and some learning things that can be affected by the levels of cortisol within our body. And then we also have two clinical pathologies to consider when you think about cortisol. One is thinking about the idea of Cushing's syndrome. So if we take a look at this diagram, these are actually signs and symptoms of somebody having Cushing's. Somebody wouldn't necessarily have all of these things, but they would present some of these if they were suffering from Cushing's. Cushing's is basically a hypersecretion of cortisol, meaning you have an increased amount of cortisol. That can be due to pituitary issues, so increased ACTH. But this could also be due to something that's happening directly at the level of the adrenal cortex as well, causing you to increase the amount of cortisol production that you have. So it could be a cause, could be because of increased ACTH, or it could be directly caused by the adrenal cortex itself. So some of the symptoms that you see are things like the moon face, the abdominal fat. So we see these abdominal striations as fat deposition takes place. Extreme hyperglycemia, muscle weakness and breakdown due to those elevated cortisol levels, elevated fatty acids in the blood due to lipolysis, and then skin ulcerations due to wounds that aren't healing, the buffalo hump, just a lot of osteoporosis because of the negative calcium balance. So lots of different symptoms associated with Cushing's disease. The other disorder to consider, this is a diagram of the moon face here, seen in this gentleman here, and then the abdominal striations due to depositions of fat around the trunk. The buffalo hump, okay, from somebody with Cushing's syndrome. The other condition to think about is something called Addison's disease. Addison's disease is actually a hyposecretion, so a decrease in the levels of cortisol. So if you had hyposecretion of ACTH and you're not stimulating the adrenal cortex, you could see lower levels of cortisol. If the adrenal cortex cells themselves were not producing cortisol the way that they should, you could have a hyposecretion of cortisol. And also in Addison's, you see a hyposecretion of the mineralocorticoids as well. So a decrease in things like aldosterone. Some of the symptoms that you want to be aware of would be electrolyte imbalances. So imbalances in sodium and potassium. And then, of course, changes in ACTH levels due to the lack of negative feedback. And when you have a lack of negative feedback on the ACTH, what you actually start to see is you start to see an increase not only in the ACTH hormone, go back and show you this figure here, but you also start to see an increase in the melanocyte stimulating hormone as well. So here we have gamma MSH and alpha MSH. And this melanocyte stimulating hormone can actually affect melanin production. And so what you'll notice is that there's a precursor molecule called POMC where we get our ACTH from, but we're also getting this melanocyte stimulating hormone as well. And so if there's no negative feedback to control this POMC molecule production, then you're going to get production of ACTH and melanocyte stimulating hormones. And so what you see in Addison's conditions is a darkening of the skin, darkening of the gums. And so I want to show you something right here. So you can see in this figure here, you can see that darkening that's taking place in the gum area. And that's due to the fact that when you lose that negative feedback, so if we look at the general pathway, CRH, ACTH, and cortisol, if you don't have the natural negative feedback, so normally when cortisol levels go up, you should have that natural negative feedback. But if you have Addison's, where you have a hyposecretion, then this goes away and you start to see elevations in ACTH levels. But you're also going to see elevations in MSH levels, melanocyte stimulating hormone, because that's a hormone that's produced from the precursor molecule. So there's a molecule called POMC, which is the precursor for making both of these hormones. So when there's more of this, there's going to be more of both of these hormones. And so more melanocyte stimulating hormone means more melanin production and means a darkening of the skin and a darkening of areas that normally don't have that. So electrolyte balance is very worrisome, but the darkening, the unnatural darkening, is a clue for your healthcare provider that you may or may not be suffering from Addison's disease. So I hope that helps. Take care.